When Victoria Hayes stepped onto the elite shooting range with her weathered rifle case, the laughter that erupted from the crowd of seasoned marksmen was so loud it echoed off the reinforced walls. What they saw was a middle-aged woman with calloused hands and an unassuming demeanor. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness skills so classified, so devastatingly precise, that the government had spent 15 years trying to erase all evidence they ever existed. But some secrets are too explosive to stay buried, and some legends refuse to die quietly. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the concrete floors of Pinnacle Shooting Academy, one of the most exclusive firearms training facilities on the East Coast, located 30 miles outside Washington, D.C. This wasn't the kind of place where weekend warriors came to plink at paper targets. This was where military contractors, federal agents, and elite law enforcement came to maintain their edge, where every lane cost more per hour than most people made in a day. Victoria Hayes stood at the registration desk, her fingers drumming a silent rhythm against the worn leather of her rifle case. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the most dangerous people were often the ones who appeared least threatening. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, streaked with premature silver that caught the fluorescent lighting. A thin scar ran from her left temple to her jawline, barely visible unless the light hit it just right. The young clerk behind the desk looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism. Hanamatag read, Jessica. And she couldn't have been more than 25. All polished nails and perfectly applied makeup that seemed out of place in this testosterone-heavy environment. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" Jessica asked, her voice carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved for people who didn't fit the expected mold. "We cater to professional-level shooters here. The public range is about 15 miles. I'm exactly where I need to be," Victoria interrupted quietly, sliding her membership confirmation across the marble counter. The document bore the seal of the Department of Defense and several signatures that would have made Jessica's eyes widen if she'd known how to read them properly. Jessica scanned the paperwork with growing confusion. The authorization codes were legitimate, but this woman didn't look like the typical DoD contractor who frequented their facility. Most of them came in wearing tactical gear and carrying equipment that cost more than a car. This woman wore faded jeans, work boots, and a simple black t-shirt that had seen better days. "Lane 7 is available," Jessica said finally, handing over a temporary access card. Please be careful with our equipment." Victoria nodded and made her way past the gleaming display cases filled with the latest in tactical optics and precision rifles. The main range was a cathedral of firepower, with 50 individual lanes stretching out toward targets at distances ranging from 25 to 800 yards. The walls were lined with sound-dampening materials, and the air filtration system hummed quietly to clear the gun smoke that perpetually hung in the atmosphere. It was here that she first encountered a group of men clustered around lanes 12 through 15. Their equipment spread out, like a military surplus store had exploded. They wore matching tactical vests emblazoned with the logo of Blackwood Security Solutions, one of the largest private military contractors in the country. Their rifles were works of art, custom-built precision instruments that cost more than most people's annual salary. The group's leader was immediately recognizable to anyone who followed the defense industry. Marcus Blackwood stood 6'4", with the kind of build that suggested he'd never met a weight room he didn't like. His salt and pepper hair was cut in a perfect military fade, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man who'd made a career out of violence. At 50, he was the CEO and founder of Blackwood Security Solutions, a company that had grown from a small outfit of former Special Forces operators into a billion-dollar empire that provided security services to governments and corporations around the world. Well, Blackwood's voice carried across the range as Victoria set up at Lane 7. Looks like someone's grandmother got lost on her way to the knitting circle. His team erupted in laughter. There was Rodriguez, a former Navy SEAL with arms like tree trunks and a personality to match. Thompson, an ex-ranger whose idea of subtle was wearing camouflage in only 3 different patterns. And Miller, a former Marine whose chest was covered in tattoos depicting every conflict zone he'd ever visited. Victoria continued setting up her equipment, methodically unpacking her rifle case. What emerged was a weapon that looked like it belonged in a museum, of Vietnam-era M21 sniper rifle that had clearly seen better decades. The woodstock was scarred and worn smooth by countless hands, and the metal showed the patina of age and hard use. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez whistled, loud enough for the entire range to hear. Is that thing even still functional? My grandfather carried one of those in Nam. Probably shoots about as well as her aim, Thompson added, adjusting the scope on his custom Remington 700 that had more electronic accessories than a fighter jet. Victoria finally looked up from her preparations, her green eyes meeting Blackwood's stare directly. There was something in that gaze that made him pause a depth, that suggested she'd seen things that would give most people nightmares. But the moment passed, and his smirk returned. Ma'am, are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable at the basic range? Blackwood asked with mock politeness. What we're doing here is, well, it's not really suitable for beginners. I appreciate the concern, Victoria replied, her voice steady and calm. But I think I'll manage. The electronic rangemaster's voice crackled over the intercom. All shooters to the firing line. Today's qualification course will be conducted at multiple distances, starting at 100 yards and extending to 600. Each shooter will have 60 rounds to achieve the highest possible score. Best score wins bragging rights and a bottle of bourbon that's older than some of your rifles. Blackwood's team took their positions with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated like a well-oiled machine. They'd done this dance countless times before, and their confidence was absolute. Victoria simply walked to her lane, checked her rifle one final time, and settled into a prone position that seemed effortless despite the concrete floor. The first string of fire was at 100 yards, and the targets were regulation-sized silhouettes with scoring rings. The range fell silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic from the highway outside. "Shooters ready," came the command. "Fire at will." The sound was like thunder contained within walls. Blackwood's team fired in rapid succession, their precision rifles barking with authority. Brass casings arced through the air, catching the overhead lights as they tumbled to the concrete floor. When the smoke cleared, their targets showed tight groupings in the X-ring, exactly what you'd expect from men who made their living with firearms. Then there was the sound of Victoria's rifle, different somehow, older and deeper. Just 3 shots, spaced with the methodical timing of someone who understood that speed meant nothing without accuracy. When the targets were scored, a hush fell over the range. Victoria's target showed 3 holes, so close together they could have been covered by a quarter. Dead center in the X-ring, but more than that, they formed a perfect triangle, each shot placed with mathematical precision. Lucky shots. Mila model. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. The range extended to 200 yards for the second string. This time, the wind had picked up, swirling through the range from the ventilation system and making the flags at each distance dance unpredictably. It was the kind of condition that separated the professionals from the pretenders. Blackwood's team adjusted their scopes, checking wind flags and making calculations. They fired their strings with practiced competence, achieving scores that would have impressed any observer. But when Victoria's turn came, she didn't adjust her scope. She didn't check the wind flags. She simply settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and fired. 5 shots this time, and when the target came back, the holes were arranged in the shape of a perfect star, all within the 9 ring. The shot group was tight enough to cover with a playing card, and the pattern was so precise it looked deliberate. "What the hell?" Thompson breathed, lowering his binoculars. At 300 yards, the challenge increased significantly. The targets were smaller, and the wind was becoming a serious factor. Blackwood himself took the first string, his custom rifle equipped with a scope that cost more than most people's cars. He was genuinely skilled, and his shots grouped well within the black. Victoria's approach remained unchanged. She studied the target for perhaps 30 seconds, noting the way the mirage danced in the heat waves rising from the concrete. Then she fired 7 shots in a rhythm that seemed almost musical, not rushed, but with a cadence that spoke of countless hours of practice ingrained into muscle memory. When the target returned, the range fell completely silent. The holes formed a perfect smiley face, 2 shots for eyes, positioned precisely in the 10 ring, and a curved line of 5 shots, creating a smile across the 8 and 9 rings. It was a demonstration of control so absolute that it bordered on the impossible. That's not normal shooting," Rodriguez whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. But it was at 400 yards that Victoria truly began to demonstrate what she was capable of. The targets were barely visible to the naked eye, and the slightest error in judgment would send a bullet wide of the scoring rings entirely. The wind had strengthened, and the flags were now whipping back and forth with genuine force. Blackwood's team fired their best strings of the day. These were men who had served in the world's most elite units, who had trained for years to achieve the level of precision they demonstrated. Their targets showed the kind of shooting that would have earned medals in Olympic competition. Victoria approached the firing line for the final time, and something had changed in her demeanor. The casual, almost apologetic manner was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. She settled into her position with movements that were economical and precise, like a machine designed for this single purpose. The first shot came after nearly 2 minutes of preparation, and the sound seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. The second followed 30 seconds later, then the third, fourth, and fifth in rapid succession. 7 shots total, fired with intervals that seemed to follow some internal metronome that only she could hear. When the target was retrieved, Marcus Blackwood actually staggered backward. The holes formed a perfect reproduction of the Delta Force insignia, the triangular arrowhead that was the symbol of America's most elite military unit. But more than that, each shot was placed with such precision that the overall pattern was geometrically perfect, as if it had been drawn with instruments rather than created with bullets fired from 400 yards away. "Who the hell are you?" Blackwood demanded, his composure finally cracking. Victoria stood slowly, checking her rifle's chamber and engaging the safety with movements that were automatic after decades of repetition. She looked at Blackwood with those green eyes that had been calm throughout the entire demonstration, and for the first time, she smiled. "Nobody important," she said quietly, "just someone who learned to shoot a long time ago." But Blackwood wasn't satisfied with that answer. His mind was racing, trying to place her face, trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. The level of skill she demonstrated wasn't something you picked up at weekend shooting courses or even in most military units. This was the kind of precision that came from the deepest levels of special operations, from units that didn't officially exist and operations that were never acknowledged. "The Delta pattern," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled. "That's not something you learned from a book." Victoria was already packing her rifle away, disassembling it with the same methodical precision she'd shown in firing it. A lot of people know about Delta Force these days. Movies, books, internet. Information gets around. Not that information, Blackwood pressed. That's the exact specifications of the unit insignia as it appeared on classified documents from 2007 to 2012. "I know because I've seen those documents." She paused in her packing, just for a moment, but it was enough for Blackwood to notice, when she looked up at him again, something had changed in her expression. The mask of casual indifference had slipped, just slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Maybe you're reading too much into a lucky pattern," she said. "Lucky?" Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lady, what you just did isn't luck. What you just did is the kind of shooting that maybe 50 people in the entire world are capable of, and most of them are either dead or working for me." The other shooters on the range had stopped their own practice to watch the confrontation unfold. Word had spread about the woman who had outshot Marcus Blackwood's team, and a small crowd was gathering. Victoria seemed uncomfortable with the attention, her body language shifting to suggest she wanted nothing more than to disappear. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said, shouldering her rifle case. "I was just here to get some practice in." "Practice?" Thompson had found his voice again, though it carried a note of hysteria. "You call creating perfect geometric patterns at 400 yards practice?" Victoria was moving toward the exit now, but Blackwood's voice stopped her. "Sarah Ghost Morrison," he said quietly, and the name hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her entire body went rigid, and when she turned back to face him, the pretense was gone entirely. "That name doesn't mean anything to me," she said, but her voice had changed. There was steel in it now, and danger. "Sarah Morrison. Call sign, Ghost." Blackwood continued, his own voice taking on the tone of someone reciting from memory. "Operational Training Group Alpha. Inst Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan between 2008 and 2014. Officially discharged due to medical reasons. Unofficially. Well, that's where things get interesting." The range had gone dead quiet now. Even the ventilation system seemed to have paused, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Victoria Sarah stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the strap of her rifle case. "You've got me confused with someone else?" she said finally. "Do I?" Blackwood smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey, because the Sarah Morrison I'm thinking of was involved in an operation in Syria that went sideways, an operation that resulted in several high-value targets being eliminated, but also in some very embarrassing questions being asked about civilian casualties, questions that certain people in the Pentagon would prefer never be answered. Sarah's hand tightened on the rifle case strap, and for a moment, everyone in the vicinity felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "I told you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the range. "You've got the wrong person. See? That's where you're wrong," Blackwood said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through something, "because I've got photos from that operation. Satellite imagery. And one of those photos shows a female sniper providing overwatch from a position approximately 600 meters from the target building, the same building where you supposedly eliminated 3 high-value targets with headshots at extreme range." He held up the phone, showing a grainy image that could have been anything to the casual observer. But Sarah's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went pale, and her breathing became shallow. "The problem is," Blackwood continued, "the official after-action report says those targets were eliminated by a Hellfire missile from a Predator drone. No mention of any sniper, no mention of Sarah Morrison. It's like you were never there at all." "Because I wasn't," Sarah said, but the words lacked conviction. "Now, then explain the ballistics evidence." Blackwood pressed. "Explain the fact that all 3 targets were killed by precision rifle fire, not explosive ordnance. Explain why the Syrian government claimed American snipers were operating in their territory without authorization. Explain why Sarah Morrison's service record was classified at levels that require presidential authorization to access." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Sarah stood frozen, caught between the urge to run and the knowledge that running would only confirm everything Blackwood suspected. "You want to know what I think happened?" Blackwood's voice had dropped to a conversational tone now. "Intimate and threatening at the same time. I think you were there as part of a black operation that was never supposed to be acknowledged. I think you did exactly what your file says. You eliminated 3 high-value targets with precision rifle fire. But then something went wrong. Maybe there were civilian casualties. Maybe someone higher up the chain needed a scapegoat. Maybe you saw something you weren't supposed to see." Sarah's jaw clenched, and her knuckles were white where they gripped the rifle case. "So they burned you," Blackwood continued. "Erased you from the official record. Made it like you were never there. But the problem with ghosts is that sometimes they come back, and when they do, they tend to make quite an impression." "What do you want?" Sarah asked finally, her voice flat and emotionless. Blackwood's smile widened. "Nothing complicated. Just a conversation. About old times. About mutual acquaintances. About opportunities for someone with your particular skill set. I'm retired. No such thing in our line of work." Blackwood said, "You know that as well as I do. Skills like yours don't retire. They just go underground for a while." Sarah was already turning toward the exit, but Blackwood's next words stopped her cold. "Especially when there are people out there who might not want certain facts about Syrian operations becoming public knowledge." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah turned back slowly, and when she looked at Blackwood now, there was something in her eyes that made several of the onlookers take an unconscious step backward. "Are you threatening me?" she asked quietly. "I'm offering you an opportunity," Blackwood replied. "Blackwood Security Solutions is always looking for operators of exceptional skill. The pay is excellent. The benefits are substantial. And most importantly, we value discretion. The kind of discretion that keeps embarrassing questions from being asked about things that happened in places that don't officially exist." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was a sound completely devoid of humor, cold and sharp as winter wind. "You really don't know, do you?" she said. "Know what? Who I am? What really happened in Syria? Why my record was classified?" Sarah's voice was still quiet, but there was something building underneath it, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You think you figured it out? But you're not even close." Blackwood's confidence wavered slightly. "Enlighten me. The operation in Syria," Sarah said, "wasn't about eliminating high-value targets. It was about covering up the fact that someone in the Pentagon had authorized the sale of advanced weapons to insurgent groups, weapons that were being used to kill American soldiers. The range had gone so quiet that the sound of distant traffic seemed unnaturally loud. The 3 men I killed," Sarah continued, "weren't terrorists. They were arms dealers. American arms dealers. And the reason my record was classified wasn't to cover up civilian casualties, it was to cover up the fact that I had documented evidence of weapons trafficking by senior Pentagon officials." Blackwood's face had gone pale. That's impossible." "Is it?" Sarah smiled. "And it was a terrible thing to see, because the man who ordered that mission, the man who told me those arms dealers had to be eliminated to protect American lives, was someone you know quite well." "Who?" "Deputy Secretary of Defense Jonathan Hartwell, your biggest client, the man who's been channeling contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Blackwood Security Solutions." Sarah's voice was gaining strength now, becoming something fierce and unstoppable. "The same man who authorized the weapons sales in the first place." The blood drained from Blackwood's face as the implications hit him. "You're lying." "Am I?" Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind that could hold hours of audio on a device smaller than a cigarette lighter, "because I still have the recordings of my mission briefings. I still have the serial numbers of the weapons that were being trafficked, And I still have the ballistics reports that prove those weapons were used to kill 12 American soldiers in 3 separate incidents. Blackwood stared at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. That would be treason. Yes, it would be, Sarah agreed. And the penalty for treason is death, which is why Jonathan Hartwell had my record classified and my existence erased from official documentation. He couldn't have me killed outright. Too many people knew I existed, but he could make sure that if I ever tried to come forward, I'd have no official standing to back up my claims. Why are you telling me this? Blackwood's voice was barely a whisper. Because 15 years ago, I made a promise to myself, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. I promised that someday, when the time was right, I would make sure the truth came out. I would make sure the families of those dead soldiers knew who was really responsible for their deaths. She held up the recorder, and the small device seemed to fill the entire space. This contains enough evidence to bring down not just Hartwell, but everyone who was involved in the weapons trafficking operation, including several current members of Congress, 2 Pentagon officials, and the CEO of one of the largest defense contractors in the world. Blackwood was backing away now, his face a mask of horror and panic. You can't. You wouldn't. Watch me, Sarah said simply. She turned and walked toward the exit, her steps steady and purposeful. Behind her, the entire range remained frozen in stunned silence. But just before she reached the door, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. Oh, and Marcus? She called out, her voice carrying clearly across the space. The next time you want to threaten someone, you might want to make sure you actually know who you're dealing with. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. But Sarah Morrison Ghost was already gone, disappearing into the afternoon sun like the specter she had once been trained to be. Blackwood stood in the middle of the range, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had just happened. Around him, his team exchanged worried glances, all of them understanding that they had just witnessed something that would change everything. Boss, Rodriguez said quietly, what do we do now? Blackwood didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, calculating possibilities, weighing options. Sarah Morrison had just revealed that she possessed information that could destroy not only his company, but his entire network of connections within the defense establishment. If what she claimed was true, if she really had recordings and documentation of weapons trafficking at the highest levels of government, then she held the power to bring down everyone he had ever worked with. We follow her, he said finally, his voice hoarse with strain. We find out where she lives, who she talks to, what her weaknesses are, and then we figure out how to neutralize this threat before it destroys everything we've built. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus Blackwood knew that he had made a terrible mistake. He had confronted a ghost, challenged a legend, threatened someone who had spent years learning how to kill from the shadows. And now that ghost was awake, angry, and armed with information that could topple governments. Outside in the parking lot, Sarah Morrison climbed into a battered pickup truck that had seen better decades. She sat behind the wheel for a moment, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Then she pulled out a different phone, one that wasn't registered to any name in any database, and dialed a number from memory. It's Ghost, she said when the call was answered. The wheels are in motion. Are you ready on your end? The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. We've been ready for 15 years. Just give us the word. Sarah looked back at the shooting range, where she could see figures moving behind the tinted glass windows. The word is given. Operation Reckoning is now active. She ended the call and started the truck, pulling out of the parking lot with the deliberate care of someone who knew they were about to become the most hunted person in America. But Sarah Morrison had been hunted before, by people far more dangerous than Marcus Blackwood and his corporate mercenaries. This time, however, she wasn't running. This time, she was hunting back. And after 15 years of living in the shadows, watching her country's leaders profit from the deaths of the soldiers she had once fought beside, Ghost was finally coming home. The truth, like a precisely aimed bullet, was about to find its target. And just like her demonstration on the shooting range, Sarah Morrison's aim was absolutely perfect. 3 hours later, in a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon, Deputy Secretary of Defense Jonathan Hartwell received a phone call that made his blood run cold. The voice on the other end was one he had hoped never to hear again, speaking words that confirmed his worst nightmare. "Hello? Jonathan," Sarah Morrison said, her voice carrying clearly through the encrypted line. "We need to talk." The ghost had returned, and this time, she had brought proof of everything she claimed. The reckoning that had been 15 years in the making was finally about to begin. And the woman who had been mocked at the shooting range was about to silence a lot more than just a crowd of amateur marksmen. She was about to silence the lies that had cost American soldiers their lives. And the truth she carried was going to echo through the halls of power like the crack of her rifle precise, devastating, and absolutely unstoppable. The secure facility where Sarah had arranged to meet Jonathan Hartwell was a far cry from the gleaming Pentagon offices where he normally conducted his business, located in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore. It was the kind of place where inconvenient conversations could be held without the risk of surveillance or interruption. Sarah arrived first, as she always did. Old habits from her operational days died hard, and she had learned long ago that controlling the environment was often more important than controlling the conversation. She positioned herself where she could see all the entrances, with multiple exit routes planned and memorized. The weight of her sidearm under her jacket was a familiar comfort, though she hoped she wouldn't need it tonight. Hartwell arrived exactly on time, which told Sarah that, despite his current position, he hadn't completely forgotten his military training. He came alone, as instructed, though she was certain there were backup teams positioned throughout the area. That was finish, had expected as much. "Sarah," he said as he entered the warehouse, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension, "I was beginning to think you were dead. Sometimes I wished I was," she replied, not moving from her position in the shadows. "It would have been easier than living with what I know." Hartwell was older than she remembered, his dark hair now streaked with gray and his face lined with the stress of high office, but his eyes were the same cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless when necessary. "We don't have to do this. You know," he said, stepping deeper into the warehouse, "whatever problems we had 15 years ago, we can work them out. You were always one of my best operators. Sarah, there's still a place for you in the new paradigm." "The new paradigm?" Sarah laughed. But there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call selling weapons to insurgents? Is that what you call getting American soldiers killed for profit? The world is more complicated than you understand," Hartwell said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that had always made Sarah's teeth clench. "Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary to maintain the balance of power. 12 soldiers died because of those weapons," Sarah said, stepping out of the shadows so he could see her face clearly. 12 men and women who trusted their government to protect them, who trusted people like you to make sure they had the best equipment and intelligence available. Instead, you sold them out for money. "It wasn't about money," Hartwell protested. "It was about maintaining our intelligence network in the region. Those weapons were being tracked. Sarah, every serial number, every transaction was monitored. We were gathering intelligence on the entire network of insurgent fighters and their supporters." "Really?" Sarah pulled out the digital recorder she had shown Blackwood earlier. "Because that's not what you said in your briefings to me. Would you like me to play them for you?" Would you like to hear yourself explaining how much profit the Pentagon was making from those weapons sales? Hartwell's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. Even if what you say is true, it doesn't matter now. That was 15 years ago. The statute of limitations has expired. The people involved have moved on. The world has changed. Has it? Sarah asked. Because from what I can tell, the same patterns are still playing out. Different wars, different weapons, but the same people getting rich while soldiers die. The only thing that's changed is the scale. She gestured toward the recorder. This doesn't just contain evidence about the Syrian operation. It contains documentation of ongoing weapons trafficking, current financial arrangements, and recorded conversations with people who are still very much active in the defense establishment. Hartwell's composure finally cracked. What do you want? Sarah? Money? Position? A guarantee of immunity? Name your price. I want justice. Sarah said simply, I want the families of those dead soldiers to know the truth. I want the American people to understand what their government has been doing in their name. And I want the people responsible to face the consequences of their actions. That's impossible. And you know it. Hartwell said, desperation creeping into his voice. The implications would be catastrophic. It would undermine confidence in the entire defense establishment. It would damage our relationships with allies. It would hold people accountable for their crimes. Sarah interrupted. And that's exactly what's going to happen. She pulled out a second device, a small satellite communicator that connected directly to secure servers maintained by investigative journalists around the world. In exactly 12 hours, she said, every major news organization in the world is going to receive copies of everything I have. Audio recordings, financial documents, ballistics reports, satellite imagery, classified communications. Everything. Hartwell stared at the device in horror. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Sarah replied. 15 years ago, you thought you could erase me, make me disappear. Pretend I never existed. But ghosts have a way of coming back. Jonathan, and when they do, they tend to bring the truth with them. This will destroy you too, Hartwell said desperately. You were part of those operations? You pulled those triggers. When this comes out, you'll be branded as a traitor, a terrorist. They'll hunt you down and kill you. Maybe. Sarah agreed, but at least the truth will be out there. At least the families of those soldiers will know who was really responsible for their deaths. And at least future soldiers might be protected from people like you. She started walking toward the exit, but Hartwell's voice stopped her. What about Blackwood? He asked. He knows who you are now? He'll come after you. Sarah paused and looked back at him. Marcus Blackwood is the least of my worries. He's a corporate mercenary, playing at being a soldier. I've dealt with much more dangerous people than him. He has resources. Sarah. Connections. People who owe him favors. So do I. Sarah said quietly. The difference is that my people actually serve their country instead of just profiting from its wars. She walked to the exit, then paused one more time. Oh, and Jonathan? When you're trying to figure out how to spin this story, remember that I still have contacts in every major news organization in the world. People who remember what real journalism looks like. People who understand the difference between reporting the truth and repeating government propaganda. The warehouse door closed behind her, with a finality that echoed through the empty space. Jonathan Hartwell stood alone in the darkness. His career, his reputation, and his freedom crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. Outside, Sarah Morrison climbed back into her truck and drove into the night, knowing that by tomorrow, the world would be a very different place. The ghost was finally ready to tell her story. And the people who had tried to erase her were about to learn that some secrets are too important to stay buried. The shooting range demonstration had been just the beginning. The real shot, the one that would echo through the halls of power and change everything, was about to be fired, and just like all of Sarah Morrison's shots, it would find its target with perfect, devastating precision. The next morning, Marcus Blackwood sat in his office watching the news unfold like a slow-motion catastrophe. Every major network was running the same story: Pentagon official implicated in weapons trafficking scandal. The documentation that Sarah Morrison had promised to release was already making its way through newsrooms across the globe, and the initial reports were devastating. His phone had been ringing non-stop since 5 a.m., with clients, investors, and government contacts all demanding explanations he couldn't provide. The stock price of Blackwood Security Solutions had already dropped 30% in pre-market trading, and congressional leaders were calling for immediate investigations. "Sir?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "There's someone here to see you. She says it's about yesterday's incident at the range." Blackwood looked up from the financial reports scattered across his desk, his face haggard from a sleepless night. "Send her in." The woman who entered wasn't Sarah Morrison, but someone he didn't recognize: a tall, athletic brunette in her 30s, wearing a crisp business suit and carrying a briefcase that looked expensive enough to buy a car. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Rebecca Chen. I'm an investigative journalist with the Washington Herald. I believe we need to talk." Blackwood's blood ran cold. "I'm not giving any interviews about your threats against Sarah Morrison yesterday?" Chen interrupted smoothly. "About your knowledge of classified operations in Syria? About your company's contracts with Deputy Secretary Hartwell? I'm afraid this isn't really a request." "Mr. Blackwood." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "You see, Miss Morrison wasn't the only person recording conversations yesterday. The Pinnacle Shooting Academy has quite sophisticated surveillance systems, and several of your own employees were live streaming parts of the demonstration to social media." Blackwood's hands began to shake as Chen spread photographs across his desk, images of him confronting Sarah, close-ups of his face as he made his threats, timestamp screenshots of his team's social media posts bragging about their skills before the demonstration began. "The internet is forever, Mr. Blackwood," Chen continued conversationally. "And when a story breaks involving government corruption and weapons trafficking, people start looking very carefully at everyone connected to the principals. Your company's name appears in the documents Miss Morrison released. A lot. That doesn't prove anything," Blackwood said desperately. "Contracts with the Pentagon are public record. Every defense contractor has contracts worth millions of dollars specifically tied to operations that supposedly never happened." Chen raised an eyebrow. "Has detailed knowledge of classified personnel records? Has executives who threaten former special operations soldiers in public?" She pulled out her phone and showed him a video that was already trending on multiple social media platforms. It was footage from the shooting range, showing Sarah's impossible demonstration, followed by Blackwood's increasingly desperate attempts to threaten and intimidate her. "This video has been viewed over 2 million times since yesterday evening," Chen said. "The comments are illuminating. It seems a lot of people recognize exceptional marksmanship when they see it, and they're very interested in finding out why someone with those skills would be living under an assumed name." Blackwood slumped in his chair, the weight of his situation finally crushing down on him. "What do you want?" "The truth," Chen said simply. "About your relationship with Hartwell. About the contracts your company has been awarded. About what you knew regarding weapons trafficking operations. About why you thought threatening Sarah Morrison was a good idea. And if I don't cooperate?" Chen smiled, and it was surprisingly warm despite the circumstances. "Then I write the story based on the evidence I already have, which, frankly, doesn't paint you in a very favorable light. But if you do cooperate, if you help me understand the full scope of what's been happening, then maybe we can frame this as a story about someone who was deceived by their government contacts rather than someone who was an active participant in criminal activities." Blackwood stared at the photographs on his desk. seeing his career and his company crumbling before his eyes. Outside his office windows, he could see protesters already gathering, holding signs demanding accountability and justice for the soldiers who had died. "She planned this?" he said quietly. "Morrison. She planned all of it. The shooting demonstration, the confrontation, everything. She knew exactly what would happen when she walked into that range." "Yes, she did," Chen agreed. "And it was brilliant. A single demonstration of skill that would force you to reveal your hand, followed by the systematic release of evidence that would bring down an entire network of corruption. It's the kind of strategic thinking you'd expect from someone trained in special operations." "So what happens now?" Blackwood asked. Chen closed her briefcase and stood up. "Now you decide whether you want to be remembered as part of the problem or part of the solution. The truth is coming out either way. Mr. Blackwood, the only question is whether you'll be standing with it or trying to hide from it." As she walked toward the door, Chen paused and looked back. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwood, you might want to watch the news this afternoon. Miss Morrison is giving her first public interview since the story broke. Something tells me it's going to be quite enlightening." The door closed behind her, leaving Marcus Blackwood alone with the wreckage of his empire and the growing realization that he had challenged the wrong ghost. Sarah Morrison's demonstration at the shooting range hadn't just silenced a crowd, it had silenced an entire network of lies and corruption that had thrived in the shadows for far too long.